All right. Now is the time. This is the big lesson. This is where we put supply and demand together. This is where we start to see why supply and demand is such an important model for explaining just about everything. And you don't have to be a business person for supply and demand to be important. This can be applied so many different places. Okay. Um, so let's start by talking about um, price and quantity. Okay. So in a market economy, how do producers figure out what they're going to charge and how much they're going to produce? Well, at first, the short answer is they kind of guess. It's not completely true. I mean, they do some market research. They try to see what other people are charging. Um, they do some market research to see how much they think they can sell. But ultimately, they're just kind of making an educated guess on what price to set and how much to produce. So, with that in mind, there's two mistakes they can make. One is that they overestimate the demand. They set the price really high and they produce a lot of it. The other mistake they can make is they set the price too low. They underestimate the demand, so they set a low price and they make very little. So let's explore both of those situations here. So let's say that here's the demand, here's the supply, and the producers decide to set the price here, and they keep producing until their marginal cost equals the marginal benefit. So they produce here. This is the quantity that they produce, and this is the price that they produce at. Unfortunately, at that price, it looks like the quantity demanded is actually much less than the quantity supplied. This is what we call a surplus. We've produced too much stuff. Okay? So imagine you're a producer. You've set the price up here and you've produced until you reach that price. And then you look and products are just not moving off the shelves. You've produced way too much. You have backups at your warehouses. And so you go, "Oh no, this is a problem." Okay, we have a surplus. So you do two things to react. The first thing you do is you start making less. Okay, if you have a surplus of goods, you're going to start making less. And we're going to lower the price so we actually start selling more product. Okay, so that takes us down to here. Isn't that interesting? All right. Well, let's say that the opposite happens. Okay, so let's say that we set the price actually kind of low. We don't realize it's low, but we set the price low and we don't make very much. So this is the quantity that we're supplying. Quantity that we're supplying at this particular price. And at that price, consumers actually demand more than we're supplying. Well, we call that gap there a shortage. Okay, this product is flying off the shelves. Everybody wants it because they're like, that's a great price for what you're getting. And so, because of that, there's this excess demand. Um, so we have a shortage of goods. Well, what do suppliers do in response? They look there and go, oh, we priced it too low. So they're going to do two things. They're going to raise their price because they know they can sell it for a higher price, and they're going to produce more. So they go from here to here. So this point right here is called equilibrium. Okay? It's a price at which quantity supplied equals quantity demanded. So this price right here leads quantity supplied and quantity demanded to be equal. So there's no shortage, there's no surplus. You're selling just about, you're producing about the same amount that is being consumed. So what we expect is, at least in competitive markets, we expect um, the um, the quantity and the price to tend toward this equilibrium point, which is where supply and demand intersect. Are you starting to see where supply and demand come together? Okay. So, this point right here, again, that may not be the point that we start out at, but over the long term, we expect to trend towards that equilibrium price and that equilibrium quantity. All right. So now we kind of see how supply and demand play together. Um, so, with that in mind, let's talk about what happens when there's a demand shift and when there's a supply shift. All right. So let's say we have um, D1 here and supply. So where do they intersect? They intersect at this price and quantity right here. Well, what happens if we have an increase in demand? Well, we talked about this before. An increase in demand is going to move demand to the right here. And so our equilibrium point moves from here to here. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means that the price increases and the quantity increases. Now, imagine there wasn't a graph here. Okay, imagine you were just using your common sense here. If something has caused people to want something more, then are we going to charge more or less? Well, we're going to charge more. If something has happened that makes people want something more, demand has increased, are we going to produce more or less? We're going to produce more. So, an increase in demand leads to higher prices and higher quantity. All right. Now, the opposite is also true. Now, I haven't shown this picture here, but I want you to imagine that instead of moving to the right, demand instead moved to the left. There was a decrease. Well, where does that intersect our supply? That intersects our supply right about here. So, what happens to prices? They go down. What happens to quantity? It decreases. So, the opposite effect happens. If we decrease demand, we see lower prices and lower quantity, both being produced and consumed. All right. Well, what about supply? What happens if supply changes? All right. Well, again, a supply shift moves us to the right. So this is our old equilibrium. This is our new equilibrium. So what has happened to the price? The price has decreased. The quantity has increased. So as supply increases, prices go down and quantity increases. Now, again, pretend like there's no graph here. Pretend like we're just like logicking this thing out. This makes sense because if production costs have decreased, what do we expect to happen to prices? We expect them to decrease. If something becomes easier to make, do we expect people to make more or less of that thing? We expect them to make more. Okay. So this is all pretty logical. Now, let's say that supply decreases. Okay, something has happened that makes this harder to make and more costly to make. Well, imagine the supply curve moving over here. Okay, well, where does it intersect? Somewhere around here. So our equilibrium point, that intersection point, has moved from here to here. So now we're looking at higher prices, okay, because we've moved vertically, and to the left, so a lower quantity. Again, this is logical. If something is more expensive to produce, then we're going to make less of it and we're going to charge more. Okay, so that's what happens when you see a demand shift and a supply shift. Now, all of this is very applicable um, to different economic problems. Whenever we see a price change or a quantity change, we ask ourselves, hey, was this supply? Was this demand? What's causing this? And we can answer those questions using this model. So I'll talk about it more in a minute.